Good morning, everyone. To those of you who have been with us for the past couple of days, welcome back to day 3 of the gathering, the intersections around anti-Black racism in the arts and digital technology. Those of you who are joining us today, welcome. You're about to join in an incredibly exciting session on looking at anti-Black racism initiatives that bring about sectoral change. That's our challenge with the panelists this morning. My name is Charles Smith. I'm the Executive Director of Cultural Pluralism in the Arts Movement Ontario, and really pleased to usher in this third day of our gathering. And I have the honor this morning of introducing a dear colleague and friend, Ashley Bomberry, who is going to give us the land acknowledgement. Ashley, as some of you may know, is Mohawk from 6 Nations of the Grand River Territory, a writer, producer, director, and administrator. She curates multicultural and diverse showcases of talents, creates discussion, and aims to build bridges between marginalized and dominant culture groups with her work. Ashley has worked with, or is working with the Canadian Dance Assembly as an advisor on Indigenous issues, and is also the administrator of Canadian Association of Dance Artists, a role that she has taken on, as I understand, in the last few months. We had Ashley on one of our programs this summer on indigeneity and the arts, and I'm sure her words remind me or come to my memory, and I'm sure they'll be inspiring for all of us who are here today. So without any further ado, Ashley, over to you.
Nyawa, thank you for that welcoming. I am grateful to be in this space and in this room to share space and to share knowledge and time with you, all of you folks from this diaspora that we exist in during this pandemic that we all exist in. It's a hard space to live in and discover, explore ourselves. I mean, like, you know, it's been really, I think, really difficult to sit with yourself, you know. You can put on Netflix, but there's only so much Netflix that you can watch till you're tired of Netflix. And then you have to sit with yourself in a room. And it's like, who am I? What am I? What do I want? Where do I go? What if this pandemic doesn't end? Or, you know, not to be hopeless in that way, but just like, you know, insightful of like, where can we dream beyond here? So I want to start with just saying a gentle prayer and welcoming us into this space with prayer and medicine. I wrote to a friend, like I had received a very, very vile text, and then my reaction was so like visceral. And then I wrote a text to a friend. I'm like, I'm loading the barrels. I am loading the barrels, but I'm loading the barrels with prayer and medicine. Here we go. So these barrels are loaded, and they're loaded with care. They're loaded with love. And like, I've taken myself down a few steps. But yeah, welcoming us into the space. Nyawa, Sego Sewa Guego, Nyawa Aguego, Ashley Go Wanahanda, Bomberry Young Yets. I'm Ashley Bomberry. My Mohawk name is Gawanahanda, and it means she carries the first word. And that's a mantle of leadership that was prayed for me when I was an infant. And I carry that. And I think that I want to acknowledge that I think that we are all leaders in this room, and we all have spaces and capacity to lead in all of the places that we have influence or privilege in. So I'm giving gratitude to those spaces and to all of your mantles of leadership. I'm a little bit Beyonce. I just want to say that. Yeah, no, she's the person I put on when I want to like pep up for one of these conversations. So that's a thing. But yeah, no, there's great knowledge, and what is knowledge if it's not shared, you know? And anything that I have within me, I have to share with the room, and with others, and I hope, not expect, but hope for the same and reciprocity. And I think that is what we're here for in Canada on traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, the Wendat, the Huron, like all of the nations that are here, recorded and unrecorded, named and unnamed. I want to acknowledge them, and that we're here on lands. We have like 14,000 years of history here or more, but that's what's recorded. So it's like, yep, we're here because someone took care of this land. And what ways are we taking care of this land? The land that we want to dance on, the land that we want to sit in front of our laptop on and clack away for hours and hours. You know, what are we doing to give back to that land? And what are we doing to care and give reciprocity to one another in community? It's all about community right now, during these times more specifically. So yeah, that's all I wanted to share, but I am looking forward to this discussion, and thank you so much for Subcomo for inviting me to be here. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Ashley. It's wonderful to have you with us again, and with your soulful words, and reminding us of our connections as allies, as friends, as people who have relationships with each other and with the earth, particularly as we go forward. And it's with that hope that we begin this panel this morning around sectoral change. It's a program or an idea that Subcomo, we're not the only ones, have been working on for some time, of how do we bring artists and arts organizations together to get us out of the competitive box and into the collaborative, to begin to recognize the importance of collective action that not just changes an artist or an arts organization, but changes the field of arts. And so that's where we're at today, talking about sectoral change in areas where we're looking at literature, we're looking at dance, we're looking at academia, we're looking at history, and we're looking at the ongoing engagement of Black bodies and allies of Black bodies in terms of pursuing this initiative, and certainly in relationship with the indigenous peoples who are the caretakers, the original caretakers of this land. I'm going to turn it over here to Tamea Wharton-Surrey, who is the moderator for this morning. Tamea's got a wonderful background in the arts as a dancer, as an arts administrator with the Toronto Arts Council for a number of years, as an activist and consultant in the arts, and now as the program manager for the dance immersion. Tamea, wherever you are, over to you.
Thank you so much, Charles. Thank you, Subcomo, for inviting me here. Thank you so much for those beautiful words of introduction. I'm humbled to be with all of you. As Charles mentioned, we're speaking about sectoral change and initiatives that bring that about. And as Charles mentioned, there are several initiatives taking place across different disciplines that are helping to tackle systemic anti-Black racism. It's important for us to not only learn about those initiatives, but also look for ways we can work together and amplify them so that we create lasting change across the sector. So today we hope to not only educate one another on some of those initiatives taking place, but to also inspire one another. Our esteemed and enterprising panelists are working on projects that are helping to bring about positive change across the sector and for individual Black artists as well. And we all acknowledge, as Charles did, that these are not the only initiatives taking place. And we honor other initiatives like spaces such as Black Arts Vancouver, NIA Center for the Arts, Wild Seed Center, and others. We honor the countless artists who've created projects, initiatives, and companies that educate, inform, entertain, and move conversations forward, all while the artists are struggling against systemic barriers and battling for more support. And we honor the arts administrators who work every day in Eurocentric spaces to open doors, create opportunities in ways that are not necessarily known or even acknowledged. And we're all standing on the shoulders of those who came before us, paving the way as we do this work. So today, because we're speaking about sectoral change, we've organized the speakers by their sector or area. So we first will start with academia, then dance, then literary arts, and then interdisciplinary practices or multidisciplinary practices. And so for each discipline, there'll be 2 speakers. And after the 2 speakers have presented, we'll open the floor to your questions, and we'll repeat that process for each of the disciplines on the panel. I will provide a brief biographical introduction to each speaker, but please visit Subcomo's website if you want more information on our panelists today. So as I mentioned, after each of the speakers go, we will open the floor to your questions. We are recording today's session, but rest assured your questions are anonymous. So please feel free to use the chat function, and Charles, our moderator, will read out as many of the questions as we can get to without identifying you. So you will remain anonymous. With that said, let's begin our panel. So we will start in the academic realm with Lynnette, Overby, and Kristen Moriah, who are discussing a project centered on the legacy of Mary Ann Shad Carey and Black arts. So first, Lynnette Overby is a professor of theater and dance and a faculty scholar at the Center for the Study of Diversity, University of Delaware. Lynnette, please take it away.
Thank you, Tamia. Yeah, so I'm not from Canada, but I've had the pleasure of immersing myself in the life of Mary Ann Shad Carey, who is an African-American who immigrated to Canada after the fugitive slave law was enacted in the US, and then has experienced many Canadian accomplishments. So I'd like my slides to begin, please. Thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to share with you a journey and exploration of the life and legacy of Mary Ann Shad Carey. This journey began with research in the spring of 2019, and this research prompted a group of poets, choreographers, composers, researchers, and educators to create a story of her life and legacy. Next slide, please. So arts-based research. This is an emerging area of scholarship that primarily uses qualitative methods that incorporate one or more of the arts in investigation. So there's a recognition that life and experiences of the world are multifaceted, and that art offers a way of knowing the world that involves sensory perceptions and emotions, as well as intellectual responses. Next slide. We began our journey in understanding and interpreting the life of Mary Ann Shad Carey with history and literature. So every participant received the Jane Rhodes book on the history of Mary Ann Shad Carey. Gabrielle Foreman, who was the leader of the Color Conventions Project, and other members of her group provided information on Mary Ann Shad Carey's background, as well as her specific participation in the Color Conventions. And this plaque, which describes the provincial freeman, was the newspaper first published in Windsor in 1853 by Mary Ann Shad Carey, who then became the first Black woman in North America to publish a major newspaper. Next slide, please. So starting in the summer of 2019, our poets, composers had created several works for the choreographers to begin their work. And this photo depicts two pieces of choreography that I was involved in. The one on the left was about her life as a child in Wilmington. It depicted her performing or playing children's games like Teddy Bear, or circle games, Little Sally Walker, and ball games. But at the end of the piece, we have a sign that's carried through that says, "No school for colored girls." And then you see the shift in the playing from fun to a defiant statement of, we will get an education. The next slide on the right, the next picture, depicts her move to Pennsylvania, where she was educated by the Quakers, and then followed by all of her brothers and sisters also were there. Next slide, please. We then showed an example of her speaking at the color conventions, where she was one of the major speakers and one of few women who were allowed to achieve this. Next slide. She also became a vocal supporter of women's rights, women's right to vote, and was depicted in this choreography of We as Women. Next slide. We also participated in community engagement. So now it was the end of the summer of 2019. All the choreography is created, the poetry, the music, and we began the performances. And we traveled to Alabama, back to Delaware, then to Texas and Belize, and then on to Delaware. This is a picture of us just arriving in Belize for our performances there. Next slide, please. And this is an example of the responses. So this was actually in Texas after the performance. The children, I'm sure they weren't supposed to do that, but all came to the stage to give a hug to Mary, the dancer who played Mary in the performance. Next slide. So education is another component of our work. We create study guides as well as teaching materials, and we try to send those to the schools when the school is the place they're going prior to our to coming to that location. Next slide, please. Then I wanted to share one of the performances that was choreographed by Marion Hammerish, with poetry by Christian Wells and music by Ralph Russell. If we could show that performance.
Over the line. Time passes and the wave crashes on top of time. With a new law passed, fate was clear. Freedom was never truly free. Even toward the north under the golden star, they were bound to gravity by the south. As many were roped, chained, and enslaved, one soul made way to escape the injustice and was able to tell her truth. She became the movement of a generation, outspoken with written syndication for liberation of black and brown bodies that bleed and believe in the freedom they seek. She became their voice, their spiritual uplift. Unearthed the unjust spirit of the wicked, all in an attempt to save her people, bound to the higher northern lands of Canada. She spread news of journalistic views to America, hoping to wake her up, open her eyes to see that black individuals are more than alive, but were people who could thrive. Despite the opposition, the mission was clear. Oppression could not silence or claim her. She overpowered the oppressor through words unheard. She overcame the injustice with a movement unchanged and went over the line in a land unbound to limitations. Yes, she truly went over the line. She overcame the injustice with a movement unchanged and went over the line in a land unbound to limitations. Yes, she truly went over the line.
And so that piece was choreographed by Marion Hammermesh, one of the choreographers for the group. And she did have a little statement before talking about how Marianne Shad Carey had to push against barriers that had been placed in her way. But in spite of these struggles, she succeeded in crossing lines and breaking barriers. As jazz musician Kendrick Scott Oracle discovered, sometimes a wall becomes a bridge, and crossing lines, breaking boundaries. And I'm sure you noticed the different ages of the group. They range from age of 11 to age 70 for students and community partners who are part of Sharing Our Legacy. Just moving quickly, research is also another aspect of the work. We do an audience survey. We've collected over 100 surveys that were distributed. This is prior to the pandemic shutting us down, where audience members indicated what they knew prior to the performance and what they gained afterwards. You can see some of the responses. Remember, one of our administrators who was in the audience for a performance, and he said, I want you to see my survey. I see I had 0, I knew nothing at the beginning, and now I know a lot. So, we really can see how performance can be a way into understanding and knowledge. Next slide. The final aspect I want to talk about is this Shad's daughter. So the researchers who, when we were in the room with all of the choreographers and the poets and the educators, we had a group of researchers thinking about let's consider her legacy. And let's do that by interviewing some women, contemporary women, who are living her legacy today. So yesterday we had an opportunity to actually share a video compilation of quotes from the women performed by dancers from the US and from Canada. Thanks to Charles for that, and for Kristen for identifying the women for us. And so that occurred yesterday at another webinar. Next slide. And this is our website, Sharing Our Legacy Dance Theater. I hope that you will visit it, and you will see a whole section on Marianne Shad Carey, as well as other materials and other productions. And next slide. So the value of multidisciplinary approach, we find that when we think about large global problems like racial justice, they're really not solved by one discipline, but the collaborations among several. And these benefits are many, including education, research, and community engagement. So thank you very much. And I'm going to pass it off now to Kristen, who will give you another view of Marianne Shad Carey.
Thank you, Lynnette. And as I mentioned, for those of you who have questions, you can start to put them in the chat, and we'll get to them after we hear from Kristen. Kristen Moriah is Assistant Professor of English with Queen's University, with expertise in African American literature and culture, African diasporic studies, and performance studies. Kristen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Tamia. Thank you, Lynnette, and thank you everybody for being here bright and early this morning. As Tamia mentioned, my name is Kristen Moriah, and I'm a professor at Queen's. My research and teaching address multiple fields, including African American literature and culture, sound studies, and performance studies. In 2017, I received my PhD from the CUNY Graduate Center, where I was awarded the Melvin Dixon Prize for Best Dissertation in African American Studies. And since joining the Department of English Language and Literature at Queen's University, I've begun working closely with Gabrielle Foreman, the founding director of the Colored Conventions Project and the director of the Center for Black Digital Research at Penn State University. And so in that capacity, I co-organized the Marianne Shad Carey Civil Rights Pioneer from Delaware to Canada West to Washington, D.C. Symposium, which was to be held at the Delaware Historical Society in April of 2020. The symposium was going to be the first meeting of its kind to bring together academic researchers, independent scholars, and creative professionals from both Canada and the U.S., whose work has been impacted by the legacy of Marianne Shad Carey. And an edited collection of new research into her life and legacy was one of the intended outcomes of the meeting. But thanks to COVID, we've now begun to pivot to an online platform for much of that work. And our kickoff event, which happened early in October, and sort of the first in a series of international, multi-institutional digital events, had more than 1,300 viewers and participants, both live and streaming. So the Colored Conventions Project and the Center for Black Digital Research core team is comprised of a group of diverse, dedicated, and energetic scholars, graduate students, librarians, and undergraduate researchers. Many of whom were formerly based at the University of Delaware, and some of whom have now migrated to Penn State to work with Gabrielle as she builds up the Center for Black Digital Research alongside Dr. Shirley Moody Turner. Project members represent a wide range of academic disciplines, including, but not limited to, English and theater. Now, augmented by North American teaching partners, our interdisciplinary team is committed to generating an online hub that brings buried African American history to digital life and attends to social justice activism in scholarship and research by offering an opportunity for deep engagement with 19th century Black political organizing. The work has been recognized by awards from the Modern Language Association, the American Studies Association, the Popular Cultural Association, and with grants from the NEH, the Mellon Foundation, and CLEAR. So in essence, what we seek to do is to bring Black feminist methodologies to digital research in the humanities. And this transnational research collective is dedicated to recovering the history of the Colored Conventions movement, and its participants in both Canada and the United States as they advanced Black visioned, Black executed efforts that demanded Black lives and Black equality and Black dignity matter. What we continue to learn from women invested in the Colored Conventions from these minutes and who were involved in this movement speaks across time and place. And speaks directly to today's political concerns and the need for movement building in ways that make them relevant and resonant, despite their sort of seeming obscurity, and indeed despite their all but erasure as a major force in contemporary history and historiography, both in Canada and the United States. And we undertake this work as a commitment to recovery that includes historical and activist redress. Personally, I take on this work as a moment in which my university, like almost all public institutions in Canada and the US, is wrestling with practical and intellectual implications of what it means to incorporate principles of equity and diversity into every level of the institution, and with an ongoing desire to foster international collaboration. So to speak a little bit about Marianne Shad Carey in particular right now, who has really become one of the main figures who our research is focused on at CBDR. Marianne Shad Carey, as hopefully you've sort of gleaned from Lynnette's presentation, right, was born into a free Black family in Wilmington, Delaware in 1823. The Shads were well-known abolitionists and active conductors on the Underground Railroad, even while living in the slave state of Delaware. Radical abolitionist John Brown, the subject of the recent HBO series, The Good Lord Bird, held a secret convention, secret colored convention in Chatham, Ontario at Marianne Shad Brothers Isaac's house. Shad Carey herself attended the first North American Colored Convention of Freemen, held in Toronto at St. Lawrence Hall in 1851. And soon after, she published A Plea for Immigration in 1852. Marianne Shad and her brother Isaac eventually immigrated to Windsor. And as a journalist and a political activist, Shad wrote enthusiastically about the benefits of migration for African Americans. She founded the Provincial Freeman in 1853, becoming the first Black woman publisher in North America. She then migrated back to the US during the Civil War to recruit Union soldiers, the only Black woman from Canada to do so. After the Civil War, she went on to become one of the first Black women in the United States to earn a law degree after graduating from Howard University. Since 1994, she has been officially recognized as a person of historical significance in Canada, but she continues to represent both the Black diaspora and Black displacement in Canadian cityscapes. She's a figure who's, I would argue, has been used to sort of placate Black Canadians while remaining marginalized in academic settings. And I have vivid memories of inquiring about materials for one of my courses and being told by a university librarian that she was A, not really Canadian, and B, not relevant to my course because I was teaching in an English department. Most of my students don't know anything about Mary Ann Shad Carey when they set foot in my classroom, right, in spite of that sort of official recognition by the Canadian historical organizations. In Chatham, Ontario, a commemorative bust of Mary Ann Shad Carey stands only a few blocks away from the site of her former home and the offices of the provincial freemen, both of which have been torn down. Alison Margot Smith tells part of this story in her brilliant documentary, Mary Ann Shad Revisited, Echoes from an Old House. At the same time, in Malvern, Scarborough, a working class neighborhood comprised predominantly of Caribbean and South Asian immigrants, an elementary school has been named for her. In downtown Toronto, we have a street named after her. And I think that there's much to be said about the fact that even as traces of her life have been erased from largely rural landscapes, her legacy has been reinscribed in places most closely associated with Blackness in the Canadian imagination. I had the tremendous fortune to participate in an event yesterday that partially celebrated the work of Dr. Jane Rhodes. This was another initiative of the Colored Conventions Project and the Center for Black Digital Research. But Black feminist scholar Dr. Jane Rhodes was the first person to actually write an academic biography of Mary Ann Shad Carey over 20 years ago. She began that work as a PhD student at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And I would say that that's a really important point, right? She didn't begin that research here. And while Black scholars like Ronaldo Walcott in his brilliant essay, Who is She and What is She to You? Mary Ann Shad Carey and the Impossibility of Black Canadian Studies have long sought to recenter Mary Ann Shad Carey as a central figure in Black Canadian studies, the traction gained in that area over the decades since Jane Rhodes published her biography and since Ronaldo Walcott published that essay, I think have been very minimal. The traction has been very minimal. If, as I've argued in the past, Mary Ann Shad Carey is actually the first person to theorize Black feminist performance, then that monumental fact actually places Canada and Black Canadian arts and performance at the center of some of the most important movements in Black diasporic arts and performance over the course of the past 2 centuries. Work by creators like Charles and Lynnette then becomes even more important in this light. But I would also like to think that we have even more work to do when we dig into the work being done by smaller Black community organizations. And again, yesterday, I was really struck by a moment when Shannon Prince, one of the women who Lynnette has interviewed for her work, spoke about the way that she performed as Mary Ann Shad Carey as part of a community group in Buxton in a play called Rainbows and Wings. Rainbows and Wings is not a play that I know has been anthologized, but I think that there's something to be said about the way that smaller Black Canadian arts organizations and groups have been holding the memory of Mary Ann Shad Carey dear. I'll close by saying that one of the reasons I believe that this work is particularly important is that drawing attention to Mary Ann Shad Carey's life and work can help us shift narratives about Black Canadians, our presence, and our cultural contributions. We are not new here, and neither are the concerns that we raise. We have a history that's rooted in radical Black feminism and a deep engagement with the arts. Canadian universities and arts institutions have a deep responsibility to support this field of research. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Kristen. And so we're opening up the floor to questions of Lynnette and Kristen about the Mary Ann Shad Carey project, about Center for Black Digital Research, Colored Conventions Project Space. Do we have any questions, Charles, for our panelists so far?
Not as yet, not seeing one.
I would like to jump in with one before we move on, and that's both for Kristen and Lynnette. What are some of the ways that all of us can engage with this work and help amplify it?
Well, I think it's important to acknowledge, to learn about Mary Ann Shad Carey through materials that are available. You know that we live in this digital world, we can have more access to the work as in schools, as well as other entities. Kristen, do you have other thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I would give yet another plug to the Center for Black Digital Research and the Colored Conventions Project. You know, because of COVID, we've been sort of pushed to translate a lot of the work that we had done in creating the on-site symposium in Delaware into a digital format. And so, you know, we've got a couple of events, you know, pretty much every season. We've had 2 events this fall, and we're coming up with another 2 events in the spring. And so we continue to have a series of events that we hope engage the public, that bring more people into this conversation. And actually part of that work is sort of figuring out who's interested in Marianne Shad Carey, who's been engaging with her in different ways. I wouldn't have known anything about Shannon Hill performing in sort of that play at all, right? Had it not been for her work with Lynnette. And it's something that she just sort of casually dropped in conversation, but it's actually quite significant, right? We have a woman who is a direct descendant of Marianne Shad Carey, who works at the Buxton Historical Society and who has actually performed as Marianne Shad Carey in herself. You know, if I could go back in time, I would write another dissertation just about that. And so, you know, there are many, many ways. And I would say, I'll drop that link in the chat, but I would encourage anyone who's interested to join in our events, take a look at the past events, and reach out directly to us. One of the ways that I became involved with the Colored Conventions Project was because that I reached out directly to Gabrielle. You know, apropos of nothing. I was excited about the work. I knew that I had a classroom space and I wanted to sort of bring some of those techniques into my teaching. And so I would say that part of the spirit of that research collective is open, right? It's a lateral organizing group, and we're eager to hear from other people who are working in this field.
We do have a question, and that is, from a Canadian perspective, do you believe that Marianne Shad Carey should receive more focus, not only in schools, but generally? And are there plans to connect living members of her lineage with the community, students, and public?
I definitely think that we all, US and in Canada, should know about her and you know, build on that legacy. And as you were talking about, we talk about anti-Black racism. The way that we move into, I think I call it this hopefulness, is by learning about people like Marianne Shad Carey, who overcame so many barriers to be successful in her time. So yes, it's for connecting to the history and to connecting to her achievements and accomplishments, I think are important.
Yeah, I think that one of the great things that is happening because of the symposium and because of Lynnette's work is that we have an opportunity to hear directly from members of her family, right? Those people who have direct connections to her and to that community, but they've been actually doing a lot of this work, right? So I wouldn't say that it's just the Colored Conventions Project that's sort of bringing this work to light. In fact, you know, I think that the Shad family members are still out there actively sort of speaking about the contributions that the Shads made to Canada right from its earliest times. I think that part of the work falls on our shoulders, right? To recognize that they've actually always been out there and always trying to advocate for the contributions, right, of the Shads.
So we have one more question, and that is, what initiatives can we implement to carry on her name, whether in the media, social media, whatever it might be?
Well, as Kristen has said, in this digital world, we don't have an excuse. I mean, we can get information that's been out there on her life, and we need people to transform that into work in the schools, because that's really where it needs to start. We need to start with our young people so they have knowledge of that. So I think that, and press-wise, I know Kristen is also going to be part of a book project that will allow even a broader audience to have access to her life.
You know, I'm hoping that an academic book comes out of the work that we do in terms of organizing the symposium. And I think that, you know, it will be an academic book. And so it will probably have a very limited audience in that way. I don't know if there are any clear-cut answers. It would be great if the Ministry of Education created more curriculum materials, right, for public and secondary schools on this topic, right? If more students at the elementary and high school level were introduced to Mary Ann Shad Carey, the work of Black poets and playwrights who have been taking her life as inspiration. And I would say that that's important right across a number of platforms. You know, at a basic level, university students that I teach, Canadian university students, still don't understand that slavery was a relevant issue, right, for Black people ever here. And so, you know, I think that it speaks to the fact that by and large, Black history is often ignored right at these levels. We need to learn about Mary Ann Shad Carey, and it would be a great place to start in terms of a broader and deeper engagement, right, in Black history and culture in those spaces.
Yeah, I was just going to say that Charles has also written a poem about Mary Ann Shad Carey that he shared in our first symposium. But this is, you know, when these kinds of ideas come up and we're in a group like we're in today, this is where we could begin to make plans, because who else is going to do it? No one but us. So we need to be the ones to step forward in that work.
Thank you, Kristen and Lynnette. May I turn it over to you for the next speakers?
Thank you. Thank you to everyone for your questions, and to those of you putting resources in the chat as well. And thank you, Kristen and Lynnette, for emphasizing the importance of education and historical knowledge. We cannot overemphasize the importance on self-esteem building and encouragement and inspiration when we learn about those historical figures and what their legacies continue to bring. So thank you. And now we're going to turn it over to dance-based initiatives with Teresa Ruth Howard and Barry Hewson discussing Black presence in ballet and the IABD Dance Theater of Harlem Dance USA collaborative initiative. So first, with Teresa Ruth Howard, who is a former ballet dancer with Dance Theater of Harlem and other companies, who founded the digital platform Memoirs of Blacks in Ballet. She also teaches dance internationally and has served multiple communities as a diversity strategist and advisor. Teresa, welcome, and please take it away.
Thank you. It's very interesting because part of the reason I created Memoirs of Blacks in Ballet was to make the invisible visible. So as we come out of our first conversation about how do we raise visibility, how do we raise awareness, I think that the project of Memoirs of Blacks in Ballet was my effort to create a space where this information is readily available and accessible to anybody and everybody, including journalists. Because for dance, for ballet specifically, the new idea of research for journalists seems to be Googling 3 articles back, right? And that's like 3 articles back, which is now the new research, if you will, right? So like the deep digging, the deep dive isn't what we do. And so what happens with specifically people of color is that what wasn't documented well in the very beginning now becomes thinner and thinner, and there's an erasure to our contributions. And so that's part of how my work sort of generated. Actually, I want to kick it over to Barry. I want to bring Barry. We're going to do like a little tag team maybe, because my connection with the National Ballet of Canada came through this work, specifically the Equity Project, which, as you mentioned, was that triad of partnerships that brought 21 ballet companies, North American ballet companies, together for a period of 3 years to work on increasing the presence of Blacks in ballet, which is a large sort of umbrella. But and part of that experience was recognizing that all of these companies were at different starting places. right? And so there were some people who had been in the work, having done some trainings and had consultants and were working very diligently, and kind of their awareness was further along than others who had just really entered the process and said, we realize we have a problem, we have no idea where to start. And so enter Barry into my world in the National Ballet of Canada. So I'm going to kick it off to you to talk about kind of what you've been doing with National Ballet of Canada, and then I'll jump back in.
Okay, great. I'll give Barry a quick intro then so everyone knows his background. So Barry is the former executive director of the Boston Ballet and the current executive director of the National Ballet of Canada and president of the National Ballet of Canada Endowment Foundation. Barry, kicking it over to you.
Thanks very much, and thanks, Teresa. Thank you, Charles, for including myself and Teresa on the panel today. I also just want to take a moment to acknowledge the challenging times that we're all in right now, and I know that everyone on this call is a leader of a family, of a community, of an organization, of an art form, that we all carry a mantle of leadership during this really difficult time, and I hope that you are all taking good care during this time. I think also I've been really trying to continually sort of remind myself of the gifts of COVID, and there are some. They're a little hard to acknowledge when you're dealing with the less positive things, but I think the space that this period of time has created for important conversations to take place is invaluable. I think I described sort of the pre-COVID time in my work as sort of being on a hamster wheel and running as fast as you can all of the time. And you always want to have this moment where you can push pause and step back and evaluate and fix and reassess and then move and push play again. And we never have that sort of gift. And COVID has provided that gift of time. And so hopefully we're all using that time wisely. I got involved with the Equity Project. So 100 pounds ago and 35 years ago, I was a professional ballet dancer. And I danced for the Washington Ballet in Washington, D.C. And while I was a young dancer there, I met Virginia Johnson, who was a graduate of the Washington School of Ballet Academy, and who, as you hopefully all know, was one of the most important African-American ballerinas largely with Dance Theater of Harlem. Sort of famously danced the Creole Giselle by Arthur Mitchell, and is just a really wonderful human being. And we got to know each other very early on in my dance career. And then later, when she took over Dance Theater of Harlem a number of years ago, we got to know each other again. We sort of got to know each other as professional colleagues. And Virginia reached out and said, look, we're going to do this project. And the idea is that we want to bring the largest ballet companies in North America together to finally have a serious conversation about the presence of Blacks in ballet. And will you participate? And obviously, the answer was an immediate yes for me personally, but also on behalf of the National Ballet of Canada. And so I'll just quickly give you a little sense of how the Equity Project work aligns with the work that we've been doing at the National Ballet. I think, the field has really focused over the last few years on representation. And so I think you're seeing a greater number of Black dancers in companies in North America. It's still not enough, but there's been intention in hiring to create a more diverse looking company. And certainly that's true at the National Ballet. We now are about 25% of the National Ballet's dancers identify as non-white. And about 20% of our board of directors identifies as non-white. So there's been progress made on that front. And I think what we've also turned our attention to is not only representation, but really about the experience of BIPOC artists and administrators and board members moving through a historically white organization. What is that lived experience like? And what do we need to do as an institution to make sure that lived experience is equitable for every member of our company. And so that's really at the heart of what we've been focused on over the last few years. As part of the equity project, we were encouraged to create equity policy statements. And I'm just going to quickly share with you the National Ballet's statement and then talk about sort of how we're supporting that. At the National Ballet of Canada, we strongly believe that embracing each of our different and unique experiences based on factors such as our cultural and racial backgrounds, citizenship, creed, sex, gender identity and gender expression, sexual orientation, age, marital and family status, ability and disability bring value to the workplace and to our company. We also recognize that Toronto is one of the most culturally diverse cities in the world, and as a major arts institution, we need to better reflect that diversity throughout our organization. We also acknowledge the historic inequities of our art form and look to further partner with our community and peer institutions around the world to remove real and perceived barriers that exist while preserving the integrity of the art form and maintaining the highest artistic standards. The National Ballet is committed to creating a more diverse and equitable workplace, advancing the principles of equity, diversity, and inclusion in our field, and approaching this work with authenticity and with respect. And to support that statement, it was very clear to me as a co-leader in the institution that we needed to bring a variety of voices to this conversation. And I met Charles Smith soon after we got involved with the Equity Project and learned about the great work that Subcomo was doing. And soon after brought Subcomo on, Charles and Kevin on, to be our equity advisors as we began to work toward an institution-wide, multi-year strategy that had built into it clear stakeholders and accountability in really moving this organization forward through the lens of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so that work has been ongoing. Charles conducted an environmental scan of ballet companies throughout North America and around the world to really understand how the sector was or was not addressing these issues, and how that aligned with what was happening currently at the National Ballet of Canada. He and Kevin conducted a year of stakeholder meetings, both with ballet leadership, internal and external, to really understand the perceptions of the company and the understanding or lack of understanding of what where we were and where we needed to go. And we assembled a task force that meets on a monthly basis to really hold our feet to the fire on keeping the work moving forward. At the same time that we were doing this work, we were in this equity project, which was really a fascinating experience. And Teresa and I've talked a lot about this. I can't say that it was a successful experiment completely, because I think I had this idea that after 3 years, we would come together as a community of leaders of an art form with some mandates that we would publicly state and then hold each other accountable to going forward. And that piece never came. So what did come was the first, in my view, I've been involved in this art form for my whole life, really the first time that 20 of the largest ballet institutions in North America sat in a room together and actually had an honest conversation. And as Teresa will remember, that first meeting was really tense. I think there was a real deficit of trust in the very beginning. I think everyone came together with good intention, but it was tense. And the beauty of the arc of those 3 years was that by the last meeting, just this past January, which feels like 100 years ago, but it was just last January, we had our final convening of the Equity Project at the Dance Theater of Harlem. And I remember sitting in the room during that last day and being quite emotionally moved at the idea that we were sitting in the sort of the house that Arthur Mitchell built. And the nature of the conversation we had on that day was so different than the conversation we had on that first day 3 years earlier. And that there was, in my view, an authenticity to the willingness to finally be vulnerable and truthful, and to move forward with intent. So I think the outcome of the Equity Project, while we didn't get that sort of sectoral mandate piece that I had, maybe unrealistically hoped for, what I do see is those 20 organizations, all in their own way, are advancing this work. I mean, many of them were already on it. They had already begun the work, but there's an acceleration and an integrity to that work that I think is a direct result of the engagement with the Equity Project. It was a remarkable experience. And so now we continue our work with CPAMO at the National Ballet of Canada. We've invited Teresa to join us as part of our equity team. Basically, the way things are working right now is that Charles and Kevin are working with me on broad institutional issues, and Teresa is focused more on the specific artistic side of the shop. So Teresa is working in small group meetings with our dancers to sort of unlock experiences and to understand how to bring those issues forward in a way that's that leads to making it a healthier place. She's also meeting regularly with Karen, our artistic director, and Christopher Stoll, the associate artistic director. She'll be talking about things like casting and season planning and costume choices and all of those kinds of things that are critical to advancing this work. And I think most importantly, particularly since the murder of George Floyd, if you'll remember, Teresa, you may not know this, so I'll share this with you. Teresa, in the midst of the uprising that occurred after the horrific murder of George Floyd, wrote a piece in Dance Magazine, basically calling out the ballet companies that were in the Equity Project and saying, if you're really with us, you cannot be silent in this moment. And so we all heard the call, and everyone wrote these statements of solidarity, and those statements were embraced by some, and then they were roundly rejected by many as being sort of tone deaf and what are you really doing? And it was a powerful moment for us at the National Ballet of Canada, where we had to move from the theoretical to these statements, and all of this kind of thing is so superficial in a way, and it had to get messy. And so we started having these small group conversations and really unlocking things that these statements can never, that statements like this can never really reveal. And so it's been a really healthy experience. I'm going to wrap it up because I think I'm rambling on a little longer than is necessary. I want to turn it back to Teresa to talk a little bit more just from her perspective as a facilitator of the Equity Project. And again, thanks for having me. Teresa?
Sure, thanks, Barry. I think it's so interesting to hear the reflections, because when we went into, I had been doing the work that I was doing with Mob Ballet, and I was asked to be a part of a design and facilitation team on the Equity Project. And we really didn't know what we were doing. They were like, just build what you think might be helpful. And yes, we went in like really excited about what we were going to do. And then we're like, oh my God, this is huge. Again, we're not all starting in the straight line. We're not all actually willing, right? We're in this room because optically, we need to be in this room. We know that the world is changing. We know that ballet is changing. And so we have to be a part of this conversation. We know we have to be a part of it, but there were people who wanted to sit in the cut and just be present and be counted. And there were some that were more active. And so what's very interesting to me is, Barry, when you say the piece about wanting the accountability piece, I recall in our second convening, at the end of it, I asked about accountability. And I was like, okay, you know, how is this going to work? Are you ready to hold one another accountable? And everybody clutched their pearls, like, oh, we don't do that. We couldn't possibly. Oh, no. And I was like, well, how is this going to get done? Right. So it's like, I think that the idea that now we understand that there's a need for accountability, and now we're looking for the mechanisms, we're looking for the how, right? Not the who, because we are the who, is an indicator of learning and of growth. One of the things that I realized, because I'm evolving in this, again, I fell into my big mouth as a writer, kind of got me into this, and then I've been evolving with this. This work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, specifically in ballet, which I think is what is my like niche, right? Like I consult from the perspective of having been a ballet dancer, knowing what those pathways are, being an educator, a professional dancer, and now and dance writer. I can kind of pull the culture apart and see how diversity, equity, inclusion either behaves or doesn't behave inside our particular culture of ballet. And so I wrote 12 steps to, I gave ballet a 12 steps program because it always felt like therapy to me. I was like, we need a 12-step program to ballet's cultural recovery, because I see now that this idea of diversity is a tool by which we can kind of like highlight all the breakdowns in the culture, including systemic racism. Right? Like, how does it behave inside? How does it show up inside ballet? And now I think what the Equity Project did do, as Barry like sort of touched on, is it helped to normalize the conversations, having the conversations. And that's really the first step. Everybody was like, oh, we don't want to tick boxes, but everybody felt the need for a box to tick because we don't have measures, right, for this process, because it's a human process. It's not a corporate process where we can, you know, there are analytics for this. Yes, more brown bodies on stage will show that, yes, there are more Blacks in ballet, but what is that experience, you know, that they're having? And I'll cite, you know, Chloe Lopez Gomez from Stadt Ballet Berlin, who just came out and created what I'm calling the second wave of the BLM flashpoint, when she's talking about her racist, blatantly racist experience inside this ballet company as the only female Black ballet dancer there. And this is not uncommon, but it's, again, one of those things where it is incremental, right? The way that we achieve this, I'm going to call it integration of ballet, has to be really, really sort of mindful, right? Because otherwise it is just performative. So I'm now working towards helping organizations embody the principles of diversity, equity, inclusion, instead of just being aware of it and then saying, let's put some things in place to say that we're doing it. We need to be it, right? And sort of that is where the evolution of the work specifically in the ballet field is right now. It's now we have artistic directors and executive directors who, for the most part, I won't say everybody, right? But like for the most part, understand what this work entails, realizing that the current hierarchy, the way that it works in ballet, will be challenged. Like the power structure might have to look and behave differently. Communication will have to behave differently. And the dancers are wanting it as well. So now it's like how do we actually do it? How do we actualize it, physicalize it in our present day? So it's not aspirational, but it's actual.
Thank you so much. A lot there. So I have a question, but I'll first turn it over to Charles to see if there's any questions in the chat.
Yeah, there are a couple. One is about links to the statements on equity. I know they exist, so if we can, gather them, we can send them out to people as part of this panel. But another comes about the recent article in The Guardian about Chloe Lopes-Gomes and the Berlin Stats Ballet. And the question really is about what kind of structural change, given the plight she's going through and that other Black ballerinas have gone through, what are the structural changes to ensure that support is there for when Black dancers do enter, as you said, Barry, this historically white Eurocentric art form and institutions?
Sorry, I lost the connection for a second. Can you repeat the question?
Oh, the question is really around the recent article in The Guardian about Chloe Lopes-Gomes and what are ballet companies doing to support the kind of structural change needed so that when a Black body enters, they stay, they're welcome, they are, etc.
Well,
allow them to thrive. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the situation in Berlin Staatsballet is indicative of a lot of the problems in the field. You have ballet masters that are of a generation that have a sort of a worldview, and they have been put on a bit of a pedestal in their company and in their field for a long time, and so they have created sort of this untouchable space. And I think there has to be zero tolerance for that kind of behavior. And Staatsballet has to be brave, and they have to dismiss that ballet master, period. Will they do that whether they'll do that remains to be seen. But I do think, I think if you look at ballet companies around the world, the ballet staff, sort of the artistic staff, are largely white. You see very few ballet masters of color in ballet companies around the world, and that's got to be addressed, I think, because I think those are the folks that are in the room with the dancers every day. They are involved in casting decisions. They have tremendous influence, and I think until we start to see artistic staffs look different, we're going to continue to run into these kinds of problems.
But also, I think that there's it's the second question, right? The first question is we need to really, really interrogate some of the practices like whitening, like the Eurocentric wigs that are in in the classical, using the productions for the classical canon. So that's the first piece, right? So the idea of asking a dancer, like the artistic staff, let me tell you, that is the fulcrum. The artistic directors can move, dancers want it. It's the gatekeepers in the middle that are the artistic staff, and they're just really doing their job. And their job is to make the ballet look the way we expect, or we've come to expect the ballet to look. So that is what we have to interrogate, is that aesthetic what we want to hold on to if we're actually saying that we want diversity, equity, and inclusion? You cannot change without changing, right? And so, although I believe that this woman from the reports that said blatantly racist things, but in her mind, she's actually doing her job. And that is what we have to really interrogate and ask ourselves, are we ready to let that part go? And then we can talk, that's how we actually really support dancers of color in the field, right? Not by doing that stuff to them and then being like, oh, do you want to talk about it? Sorry.
Thank you. No worries. It's all good. Thank you. I think we have time for maybe one more question. I'm not seeing anything here.
I have one if there's not another. So it's sort of taking off of what Teresa was saying. One of the huge issues, of course, in ballet is that of the body and body type and those aesthetics. And so and of course, it's such a difficult conversations to talk about the body. And so how have those conversations been going? You know, a Black dancer might be the best choice, but is either too tall, too short, too thick in these areas, too whatever, too something. How have those conversations been going?
Yeah, I mean, Teresa, you want me to start? So I think, well, first of all, there are beautiful, quote, ballet bodies that are Black and brown, and there are beautiful, quote, ballet bodies that are white. And then there are certain bodies that are never going to take to this kind of endeavor, whether they're Black, brown, white, or other. So that's just, I think that's a bit of truth. I do think if you look at ballet, and Teresa, call me on this if you don't agree with me. You probably don't agree with me, so call me. But I actually, in my lifetime, sort of when I was a young dancer, many of the American ballet companies were what we called the cookie cutter companies. You had to be a certain height and a certain size and a certain shape and a certain physique to get into the companies. And there were certain companies that were, obviously New York City Ballet was the prime example of a company that was a very specific aesthetic. I would argue that in the last 20 years, that has evolved. And I think ballet companies, particularly in North America, the shapes and sizes of dancers has become much more diverse than it once was. I don't know what else to say to that, Teresa. I'm going to turn it to you.
I love to pick this apart because first we have to really let's talk about the language. The ideal body, a ballet body, is mutable. It's changed over the years, over the decades. It is simply a preference of aesthetics, and we have to ask whose lens and whose gaze that is. Usually it's white male artistic directors, specifically choreographers, because they need the body to do a certain thing. And so if we start there, that's one. We also have to talk about the idea of like its numbers, right? If you put 100 white girls in a room, only probably 15 of them will have the ideal perfect body, right? If you put 100 Black, Latino, Asian girls in a room, you'll probably come out with the same numbers. If you're seeing less, right? Specifically Black dancers, if you only see 25, then yes, there's a chance that none of them will be suited for ballet, right? So therein lies that fallacy of like the Black body. There are white dancers who don't have ideal bodies, don't have the right feet, legs don't fully stretch, not really flexible, but they are seen through a different lens and given a chance. And when they succeed, those flaws are there in spite of. Whereas those flaws on a Black or brown body become the reason why they're not suited. And so therein lies that bias and that racism. And so we have to change the way we're talking about the conversation. So I stop the idea of like that these bodies aren't suited for, that is old racist language. Right. One of the things that have, I think most people have stopped saying is when we talk about diversity is, oh, but we have a standard, which is inherently racist, which implies that if we bring these other people in here, then the standard has to be lowered or changed in some way. And that's not what we're saying. Right. So I think that it's reframing some of these topics that have been barriers. The same thing goes with, ballet is so expensive, right? So that's implying that all Black or brown people are poor or can't, right? So we have to really reframe that in order for us to really attack this work with a level of equity.
Thank you, Barry and Teresa. I think we can move on. Tamaya?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, and if I'm sure more questions will pop up and we'll get to as many as we can at the end. So we're going to turn our attention to the literary world and some initiatives that Jessica Kirk and Leslie Fletcher are going to discuss, where literary service organizations are engaging or working to engage more with Black writers. So I'll introduce both speakers together. Jessica Kirk is a cultural curator, project manager, and the membership equity and engagement coordinator for the Writers Union of Canada. And Leslie Fletcher is a book industry and nonprofit programming professional and the executive director of the League of Canadian Poets. I'll turn the floor over to you both.
So I'll start out. First of all, I do want to thank everybody who has given us so much to sort of like think with and engage with throughout the presentations this morning. I learned so much about like the intricacies of anti-Black racism in the ballet industry, and also a lot about the work that's happening out of Queens and the literary department. So I'm very excited to learn more from other speakers today, and I'm also really excited to speak with you all about the work that has been happening on the Canadian literary and publishing industry side of this sort of creative culture discussion on really addressing anti-Blackness. And I do also want to say that I really appreciate some of the conversations that came out of the most recent discussion. I think across the different art sectors, there is a much smaller margin of error for Black artists. And so I really, really do appreciate Teresa, you taking the time to really point that out. And I think also when you were speaking about the aesthetics, this perceived, the attachment to a particular aesthetic, it also made me think about, and also you were talking a little bit about this middle man that we also need to be thinking about as well. That's something that also was important for us to think about in the literary industry as well. And I thought about it, I think about it in a different kind of way because, and I'm bouncing a little bit, but we do speak a little bit about the different aspects of the literary industry that need to be really, really tackled, particularly to support Black writers. When I met with Black writers earlier this fall, and I'll speak more deeply about this later on today, they spoke not only about the experiences of Black writers, but also the experiences of Black editors and Black agents and Black people across the industry and the ways that we really need to challenge what it is that we're challenging when we talk about addressing anti-Black racism in CanLit. So I really do appreciate this conversation around the aesthetics of sort of like a response to anti-Black racism, because similarly, there were many conversations about how easily people sort of attach to lip service sort of like statements and not actually, and folks not really being able or willing to really put in the nitty-gritty work. So yeah, just a few things that I wanted to mention that I really did appreciate about the conversation we just had. But onto what I did want to speak about today. I'm speaking on behalf of the Writers Union of Canada. It's a literary art service organization that was founded in 1973. We are 2,100 members strong, and the work that we do with the union is to promote the rights, the freedoms, and economic well-being of writers. Some of our victories over these past few years, decades and such are public lending rights and also access copyright. So we do, again, a lot of work around economic justice, but we also, besides the advocacy pieces, we also provide a lot of programs and services to serve Black writers. I'll spend the majority of our time today speaking about the advocacy piece and some of the conversations that we have been doing within the union to move conversations forward around supporting Black writers, supporting Black writing, and also just pushing towards addressing anti-Black racism in the literary and publishing industry. But before getting into that, I do want to speak a little bit about the lineage and sort of how we got to this moment a few months ago, where we convened with a number of Black writers with a conversation that was led and facilitated by Lawrence Hill, because there are a lot of there's a lot of groundwork that sort of went into where we are today. When I was hired in 2018 with the Writers Union, the union was just a year shy out of releasing its equity implementation plan. Part of the work around the equity implementation plan, which was written and developed with support from Charles, who was really integral in bringing this conversation together today, was to just really look into the weeds of the Writers Union of Canada and figuring out how to address inequities within the union. And this was a much more broad conversation around inequities across sort of conversations around gender, ability, sexual orientation, et cetera, and not particularly about anti-Black racism per se, but this is sort of one of the seeds that has helped to really germinate the conversations that we were able to facilitate later this year. So through the equity implementation plan in 2017, some of the goals that were set out were to hire an equity coordinator, which is how I got there. A lot of the other work that was done was around raising public awareness about Black, Indigenous, and racialized and other historically marginalized writers, to assist marginalized writers with access to grants, agents, publishing opportunities, to really look into the weeds of our membership application criteria, because there are a lot of ways in which writers from different marginalized communities sort of access this work around writing, not simply through publishing the big sort of dream of having your first book published through a commercial publisher, but there are a number of other ways that writers do writing, through spoken word, through speaking engagements about writing projects, through performances, through prose, poetry, and other kinds of writing that are published in smaller magazines. And so really looking into the weeds of the membership criteria was a really big part of implementing equity initiatives within the union. We also did a lot of work into really addressing inequities within our publication, Right Magazine, and we have an editorial board with an equity who sort of reviews the equitability piece around the articles that are accepted through Right Magazine. As well as, there are a number of other things, but another thing that was important too is obviously looking into our juries, because we host a number of writing awards. We have a short prose competition. We also have the Danuta Gleed Award, who looks into accepting writers for short fiction writing. And so I say all of this to say that we really did a lot of sort of groundwork within our organization to ensure that equitable practices, processes, adjustments were made to better serve marginalized writers. And prior to that, way back in the 90s, there were also conversations in the union around racial, how to better support writers who are racialized, so Black, Indigenous, and racialized. And obviously the language has sort of changed and adjusted over the years, but I say this to sort of pay homage to a lot of the members in the early to mid 90s who were also speaking about some of the same conversations that came out of the Black Writers meeting in September of this year. In 1994, there was a conference called Writing Through Race, and the union helped to sponsor the conference. There was a lot of resistance to actually initiate the conference because it was closed off to particularly like racially marginalized writers, and there was a lot of sort of work to have the funding revoked for the conference, but thankfully there were fundraising efforts that were put forward in order to ensure that this conversation did happen. And so fast forward from the equity implementation plan in 2017 to the summer where it sort of really seemed like the world stopped for the second time. We're all really grappling with the really stark adjustments that folks have had to make because of COVID-19. And it sort of seemed like there was a second really, really stark and prominent reckoning that had to happen in the summer over addressing anti-Black racism because of, again, like the murder of George Floyd, not only George Floyd, but a number of other deaths that have happened at the hands of police in the United States and Canada and around the world. And at the Writers Union, we sort of did the work of obviously like putting forward a statement, but quickly realized that, again, like statements are one thing, but we really have to think about what we're tangibly doing to support Black writers. It's a lot easier to sort of say that you're doing the thing and really play around with the words that we're hearing so often around listening and learning from Black writers. But we thought that it would be important to really take this moment to stop and consider and really actively learn from the experiences of not only our members, but Black writers across Canada, and really figure out what we can be doing better to serve Black writers' needs specifically. The Equity Implementation Plan did a lot of groundwork around figuring out how to better support marginalized writers in different kinds of communities. But since I started working at the union, there hadn't really been any sort of windows to particularly address anti-Black racism. And so we decided on working with Lawrence Hill to speak with him about sort of his experiences as a Black writer, navigating the Canadian literary and publishing landscape, and figure out what we could do to sort of create a platform to better engage with and learn from Black writers and figure out what to do moving forward. And so Larry and I did a lot of sort of back and forths around how like advocacy pieces could work, what kinds of conversations we could have either with Black writers specifically, or how the union could serve as a conduit of sorts to serve those needs, and landed on hosting a Black writers meeting to just listen and really figure out what Black writers want to see from the union, and also just offer a space where people could just talk about sort of grievances that they might have had with the publishing industry. We thought that there would be around like 5, maybe 10 people who might have been interested in coming together. Again, recognizing that we were in the middle of a pandemic, but the 5 or 10 that we anticipated grew to a number of around 60 participants who were interested in having these conversations. And in September, there were a lot of, again, really, really important dialogue that happened with Black writers that really steered the inevitable sort of document that came out of the discussion, which we can attach in the chat section over to the side. It's a bit of a report that speaks about the different aspects of the literary industry and what different aspects of the industry can be doing to, again, better serve Black writers. I'm going to hand it off to Leslie, who can speak more about the programs and services aspect of the conversation. And I'm happy to answer any questions that folks might have about the report itself.
Well, hello, I'm Leslie. I'm from the League of Canadian Poets. We are very similar to the Writers Union of Canada, but we have a more specific focus. Instead of working with all writers, we work with poets. So we're coming up on 1,000 members, which is the biggest the league has ever been. And in the last, I would say, 4 or 5 years, we've been engaging very strongly with trying to create programs and services specifically for BIPOC writers. The reason being, the league has historically served very sort of very traditionally published white writers as a majority. And one tension and one reason for this is a tension within the organization and within the industry between spoken word and written poetry. Historically, sort of published poetry has been highlighted in the league, more supported in the league. Our prizes tend to center around it more, whereas spoken word, which is very popular among Black and Indigenous poets, has sort of had a lower standing and has not quite been so supported. So there's a lot of historic, I would say, underserving of parts of the community, and then a little bit of distrust that has come out of that as well. And so we've started to approach that, I would say, by taking a approach that's very similar to Writers Union, but in a different order because we're a little smaller. So in the past few years, we've really tried to alter our programming to be more inclusive of, BIPOC writers, and particularly, Black and Indigenous communities. So we've had a whole range of different things that we've done, but essentially we've tried to be more welcoming with a multi-pronged sort of strategy. We've created, specific publications that highlight the work of Black poets. We're reaching out to Black and Indigenous poets to do writing projects for us, making sure that we're doing sort of readings and professional development and meetings that are specifically for poets in these communities. And we've started to see a bit of a shift. And we've actually had a lot of success with this, and we've had our membership grow, and we've, seen a bit of a shift. And now we're entering a phase where we want to make sure that this isn't just a blip in the history of the league. So right now we have a really dedicated staff. We have a very dedicated board of directors, and that's wonderful. And they're very committed to doing this work. But we want to make sure that when people burn out and move on to other things, that the league continues to operate in this way. So we are sort of, I would say, doing some similar stuff to what Jessica has already worked through. We're reviewing our membership criteria to be more welcoming to spoken word members in particular, introducing new bylaws and rules for, structure and inclusion, and sort of mandating that we come up with a more sort of inclusive succession plan. And then on the other side of that, I'm surprised by how strongly the ballet conversation aligned with the literary world. But one thing that we've noticed and that we really need to work on is ensuring that BIPOC people are included in the staff at arts organizations. And that's something where we have a lot of work to do. We're nonprofits, we're not super funded. We don't have, a ton of money to pay salaries. So I think that's part of the solution we're working on as well. We want to make sure that we create a financial background to make sure that we're paying, staff and consultants a good living wage. So I would say that's next in our plan as well. We're making sure that we get some money together so we can pay people for their expertise and sort of change and shift the way that we've been, working in the past. The pandemic actually gave the league a really good opportunity to do some experimentation with how we do meetings. So we've done a few, local meetings of Black and Indigenous writers, like city-based, just to try it out. They've been really great conversations, and people have really enjoyed the opportunity to come together. So despite this horrible time, we are lucky to have been able to kind of try that out with everyone. And in our next phase, we're sort of working toward developing new prizes. We're looking toward partnering with, emerging organizations like Speak North to make sure that they're supported, and, find the money and funding to put behind these great programs. So it's been a bit slow. I will also note, there has been some resistance from our membership. So that's been, a little tricky on our staff and our volunteers as well. It can be tiring. But we have seen people working very hard, and it has been really great. I just want to shout out again to work with Jessica at the Writers Union. We've been working together on a few things, and I'm just very grateful that she has included us in that great work. Jessica, did you want to talk again?
Sure, I did. I got a message asking about some of the work that we're doing to support BIPOC writers. So I think that I can finish off by sort of packaging everything really neatly for us here. We absolutely are. The Writers Union of Canada and the League of Canadian Poets have worked on 2 years worth of mentorship programming. We just wrapped up our second year of hosting a mentorship program called BIPOC Writers Connect, which this year was based, we had 2 programs that were run, one in Toronto or Ontario virtually across the province, and also another that took place in Vancouver, in the greater Vancouver region. And any Black, Indigenous, or racialized writer was welcome to send in an application, a writing in progress, and they were paired. Some people were selected and paired with established Black, Indigenous, and racialized writers to work on their manuscripts, polish it up so that it's ready for submission as a manuscript to publishers. And these emerging writers also were given opportunities to learn from funding bodies. They also spoke with one another through a mentorship sort of icebreaker that was facilitated to speak with one another on the Zoom conference. And in addition to that, there was also a closing panel that also featured a first page challenge, where there was like an anonymous first page of writing, and there was an agent as well as a small publishing editor and a literary magazine editor who took a look at the writing and really spoke about what it is that they see in the writing. So I would absolutely encourage writers who are on the call to head over to either TWUC's website or the League's website to learn more about BIPOC Writers Connect if they're interested in being involved with the project in 2021.
Thank you, Jessica and Leslie. Just looking to see if there's any questions in the chat room. Leslie, can you elaborate some more on the following? What are some of the quantifiable resistances you're experiencing?
So we've had it a few times, and I wouldn't say anybody's organizing to get our funding removed or anything quite that dramatic, but we'll often, at our AGM or large member meetings, introduce a new, program. Like, we did a chapbook just for, Black poets 2 years ago. Did a book for LGBTQ members a year ago. We often have an older member stand up and complain that work should just stand on its own merit and there's no need for these. Or very if people have to submit to our awards, we often will ask, I would say, more questions than we have historically, just so the jury can sort of see everything as it is. We'll often have old members who refuse to participate because they think that people should just know who they are and everything is reputation based. And I would say it's just sort of, the merit argument, Sherry. It's very, this kind of blind, naive view that the world is fair. And if people, if their work was all that good, I would have already heard of it. So generally, our approach to that is to just kind of brush it off and reiterate our reasons for doing it and, not get too grumpy and proceed ahead with the good work. But also on surveys, we'll get anonymous comments that people are like, all of this, that they'll give us sort of a verbal one of these and say they're tired of hearing about these different initiatives, but off we go anyway.
I wonder if I can just follow up, because I know when I was doing the work with the Writers Union, we actually had a survey that went out, and I was astounded by some of the negative comments of resistance that I saw. So I'm just wondering, Jessica, is that changing? Because some of those comments were just very ugly.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. I think that how do I say this? So I think that because we have been doing more and more programming, advocacy, and providing more services to particular communities, I think that people have grown a bit more accustomed to or anticipating these kinds of initiatives. I was also a little bit worried about how the members would respond to the call for Black writers to attend the meeting. I was very nervous when the call was about to be made out, because it was an invitation that was circulated to the entire membership, but in the email it said, okay, we're asking Black writers to attend this meeting. We want to be able to carve out a space where Black writers could speak about their experiences in Canadian literary and publishing. And so there was actually a lot less resistance that I anticipated, which was a really, really pleasant surprise. So I just think that people are getting a little bit tired of continuing to complain and know that it's going to happen. I don't know if that answers your question,
Well,
but
that does. But I think also there's a comment as well that I think links to the earlier comments, Teresa and Barry, around this notion of merit and whether or not standards are being lowered because, you know, both your organizations are bringing in writers from different backgrounds. Can either of you speak to that? And then we'll have to move on to the other panelists.
From our side, I would say, well, poetry and many forms of writing are subjective. I would say, like, I don't know, probably slightly more subjective, but then, you know, can you lift your head behind your leg in ballet, right? So it's a little murky. But I would say I've noticed only an increase in the quality of submissions we get for all of our programs. I think there's no concern with merit on our side. And whenever there is a concern about merit, we usually turn everything into blind submissions. So no one knows who's evaluating anyone anyway. And then it, you know, we'll sort of remove that wherever possible. Jessica, are you noticing anything with that?
With respect to conversations around merit, there has been a bit of resistance from some of the members. I don't want to say the entire membership, but some of the members around the ways that our self-published writers are accepted into the union. Because there's like a whole peer review process, like an anonymous peer review process that's incorporated into the acceptances through the self-published route. But I think that writers now have much more flexibility around being accepted into the union, thankfully. So even though there are like absolutely some people who want to maintain these sort of like gatekeeping standards around who's accepted into the union, there are thankfully a myriad of ways that writers can access supports from the union through the adjustments that we've made to our membership application process.
Thank you. I pass it back to you, Tamaya.
Thank you. Yes, so our final discussion pair will be looking at multidisciplinary or cross-disciplinary initiatives. So we have a video presentation by Mercy Nabirye and then discussion by Kevin Ormsby, talking about sectoral change in dance and multidisciplinary spaces such as One Dance UK and Subcomo's organizational change initiative. First, we have a video presentation from Mercy, who cannot join us because she's at a UNESCO event. Mercy has spearheaded a number of initiatives for African diasporic dancers in the UK, including serving as head of dance of the African diaspora at One Dance UK. So let's view Mercy's presentation for us now.
Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to join this conversation with the UK. I'm Mercy Nabirye, a local of London, of Ugandan heritage in East Africa, and connected to a network of amazing people and organizations globally. So thank you, Subcomo, Charles and Kevin, for inviting me to this much needed platform, more so now than ever. I will respond to this topic of sectoral organizational change by sharing my story and highlighting 3 significant moments in the past 10 years of working in dance, an environment with shifting paradigms where organizations and my position continue to transition to respond to the needs of the Black dance sector in the UK. That is, as director for ADAD, Association of Dance of African Diaspora, as head of Dance of the African Diaspora at One Dance UK, and as founding director and consultant at Kalma Arts. In 2011, as director of ADAD, my role was to steer the organization with a vision of supporting the practice and appreciation of dance of the African diaspora to be valued and visible as part of the British culture offer. ADAD was set up in 1994 as a response to a sectoral need, and so it started with a community focus and was arts-led. Eventually, it was mainly concerned with developing the context and infrastructure for professional and theatrical practice to move the practice from the margins to the mainstream. It was imperative that to achieve its objectives, ADAD as a small organization had to work with partners. Now the programs included the Trailblazers Fellowship, a tailored annual program for professional development, which supports research and practice, mentorship, and life coaching sessions alongside entrepreneurial skills training. We currently have a legacy of 42 strong professionals on the alumni, currently impacting the dance landscape. The Bloom National Festival that celebrated dance of the African diaspora across the country in all its diverseness, taking that in new spaces and with new audiences and partnering with museums, outdoor facilities, performance venues, and other site-specific public spaces. Between 2009 and 2017, it engaged a diverse audience of over 50,000 members of the public in a Black dance experience. The tours of the Heritage Photographic Exhibition, Moments, which puts the spotlight on Black dance and has a complimentary reader voicing Black dance, the Black experience 1930s to the 1990s, generated a footfall of over 70,000 members of the public between 2007 and 2015. Now, the Regenerations International Conference, which brings together academia and practice under one roof to shape future practice, is delivered in partnership. And for me, it is a great example of the power and strength of collaboration. Well, Dance Immersion is the Canadian partner, and in 2016 and 2019, we hosted a delegation of around 22 Canadians on each of the conferences. In April 2016, ADAD entered a merger with 3 other organizations, Dance UK, Youth Dance England, and National Dance Teachers Association, and formed a sector support organization now known as One Dance UK. I would say it was a merging of cultures, and the process took 2 years to complete. The remit for One Dance UK. The remit for One Dance UK is to lead the way to a stronger, more vibrant and diverse dance sector. It supports the dance workforce to achieve excellence in performance, education and management, and it advocates for the increased profile and importance of dance in all its diverse forms and settings. It also enhances dancers' health, well-being, and performance, and identifies gaps to provide opportunities and improve conditions for dance to be learned, discussed, and seen. Entering a wider national remit was the next level of working on more visibility and being valued in the mainstream. We dropped the A at the front and adopted the specialism we now refer to as DAD within One Dance UK. I stayed on as head of dance of the African diaspora, and for me, I saw my role as being a custodian for an organization which was a true reflection of the growth of a national perspective on dance for decades. ADAD aimed to reflect what was going on in the real arts world and to correct the inequalities and lack of diversity, starting way back in 1994. It was therefore important that in all we do going forward, we stay mindful of the legacy of the past and conscious of our responsibility to build a better future for the profession and the art form. So the first major thing I did was lead my team to embark on a mapping exercise, which started in the autumn of 2017. In terms of the methodology, we conducted a survey to better understand the current sector practice and the key issues affecting professionals working within the DAD sector to ensure that our programs and the new way of working was still fit for purpose and meets the changing needs. We wanted to know where that was happening, what it looked like, and what the priority needs were for sector growth. In the summer of 2018, we used findings from the initial survey to host face-to-face research focus groups nationally, and we held one-to-one sessions connecting on the ground with key independent artists, organizational leaders, venue partners, programmers, and funders. We put together further demographics of who was working, how they were working, and what they were working as, looking at things like male to female ratios, disability, age, length of career, and so on. We made sure that what we did there, we made sure that we share findings with the wider sector along the way. And we used simple infographics and narratives spread in our biennial magazines, that is the Hotfoot Online, A Voice for Dance of the African Diaspora Perspectives, and One, which is a printed magazine for all Dance UK members. In November 2019, we launched the report from the mapping research, and we shared the findings and emerging themes with the delegates that came to the Regenerations International Conference themed Dance and the Digital Space, as if we knew what was ahead of us for 2020, right? Kevin and Charles were among the delegation that joined us in a World Cafe style roundtable to discuss the themes and come up with some practical outcomes to help us shape the goals and action points to take forward. We have shared the action plan framework and a call to action for the sector to be part of making this sectoral change. And here we are. As you can tell, we have been addressing some of these systemic inequalities and gaps in provision for Black dance for a long time. No doubt the COVID pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement exacerbated the situation, leading us in a triple crisis on health, race relations, and economy. So we are revisiting some of the action plans as a result, and we are reimagining strategies, as is the rest of the world. One of the immediate things we did was to hold Zoom meetings with the sector to pinpoint the real impact. We included these findings in a letter to government and councils and funding bodies to consider ways in which they could help the sector back to recovery. The Black arts community in the UK has been energized by what is happening globally. And I would say that this is the most I have seen our communities across art forms come together intergenerationally and internationally to dialogue. Initiatives and campaigns continue to emerge to address systemic racism, discrimination, and hold space for healing and accountability. I truly wish for something different and special to emerge from these gatherings. At One Dance UK, we are working hard to support the changing needs of the dance sector. For example, we're supporting a role to represent us on the freelance task force addressing immediate needs for freelancers with councils. We supported campaigns like the Game Over campaign. It challenges government with unhelpful labeling of community groups. We also have our campaign, for example, I Move, to promote visibility of the practice and practitioners across media platforms. And this autumn, we were one of the supporters for the anti-racism conference for the UK theatre and dance sectors called Speak, Listen, Reset, Heal. It is a slow dance. And 26 years on, we're still figuring it out. But we're still moving, and we mustn't be discouraged. So, I will end on a personal note to say that in August 2019, I founded Calma Arts because I have plugged into various communities and creatives with amazing talent in dance and beyond dance over the many years in this profession. My remit now is to continue to work with individuals and organizations to connect communities, raise profiles, and enable initiatives and meaningful exchanges globally. There is strength in numbers. I also believe that we each have a role to play to bring back this change. Kauma Arts is my part. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Mercy, and your inspiring work across the UK and across oceans, really. Let's move on to our final speaker. Kevin Ormsby is the Artistic Director of Cachet Dance, Program Manager for Subcomo, and Professor of Dance Performance at Centennial College. Take it away, Kevin.
Thank you, Tamia. Mercy ends with something personal, and I will start with something personal. I don't plan to actually be nice about this. I think Subcomo exists because of the inequities that exist in the sector. And so I want to speak about those particular things from a particular set of perspectives. Before I do so, I want to connect back to Ashley in the morning around the mantle of leadership. And we should acknowledge that it has not been equitable, diverse, and inclusive for many IBPOC artists across the country, especially in Canada. At Subcomo, we're passionate about the potential of realigning the core values for the arts to reflect this new demographic of Toronto, Ontario, and also Canada. I want to start there. It might be discomforting for you, some of you on the call, and on this particular participation. I'll call my privilege that I also am holding this knowledge as the program manager for Subcomo. I want to say, like Liz Lerman has, that turn discomfort into inquiry. I'm going to start there, and I want to start with an offering as well, which is a question. It's a layered challenge. What does it take in being a reflexive organization is a critical understanding of what the organization is doing and has done in the sector. And that might be not address discrimination, not address some of the inequities, not address some of the ways in which organizations and the sector should be considering more pluralist way of looking at the arts. Subcomo and I put challenges forward. We want to instill at the grassroots of organizations the importance of transformational change. We want to invest in the time it takes and the learning required to achieve that efficacy. We want to inquire how to always be true, gracious in your quantitative and qualitative evaluations and assessment in living up to that particular portion of statements made by an organization. And we at Subcomo hold organizations and the sector to it. We're sort of the police. And I do a really, really good job of policing the sector, because I think in my role at Subcomo and in Subcomo POC, which I'll speak about, it's about understanding the sector, the demographic shifts, and those who are impacted by it, in particular, those who are not benefiting from it as much. And that, for the most part, are IBPOC artists and arts organizations. And those, since the beginning of Subcomo, is what we start to work in supporting. We started to do that by offering workshops around marketing, data understanding, data assessment that was specific to IBPOC artists. We've moved into this program around working with the sector through organizations and looking at pluralism for organizational change. We're curious about cultural pluralism for an organizational change perspective for almost 10 years now. And this led to the program which we call Subcomo POC. POC, of course, is deliberate. It's for pluralism for organizational change, because we strongly believe that there are innumerable artistic, social, personal benefits of a pluralistic approach to the arts. The changes and those of increasing the artists from these particular communities is what we are passionate about. We want to acknowledge also that governments, organizations, and funding bodies have undervalued the growth of Indigenous and racialized communities through what we say is a Eurocentric lens. I'm going to get very Jamaican. I'm going to come here for giant church and I'm going to talk about things. There's systemic issues here in the way in which we look at what is the role and how Black artists, artists of color, are actually working within the particular system. It's historic, it's bureaucratic, and we at Subcomo and through our programs try to challenge and unpack that through the education of the larger organizations which we work with in the sector. What is required in that for us at Subcomo and for myself is all that has been mentioned here before. So I feel like I'm going to repeat some things as mentioned by everyone, because I think that's my role, is to, first off, to understand sectoral change, you must understand the sector. And as Lynnette mentioned, that might be arts-based research, that might be research based on creative practices, that might be research based on education. And then through our programming, we shape and change that particular understanding for organizations. We use workshops, we use publications. If you've not been to our website, tools and resources, tons of research material on how to support the work in changing a sector. I want to also say here, though, that sometimes when we think about that word change, we think it's very quick. And change should be incremental. It should be slow. It should come through the education that we do with organizations to elicit the change that they want to see first internally for their organization, and then challenge them to think about how they're working with other organizations to impact the changes in the sector. Subcomo POC, or the Pluralism for Organizational Change, Arts and Education Initiative, is one such way in which we've been working over the past 4 years with now about over 35 organizations, and they go through a 2-year cohort of working with us. We start with the idea of how we're communicating as a community, how are we understanding practices as a community, and then what are the action items that you want to take forward in understanding equity, diversity, and inclusivity for a broader pluralistic understanding of the sector as well. We challenge them, we push them. We also then are curious about those action items that becomes part of the change in which the organizations will do, but we also encourage that the organizations within a particular cohort is actually working with each other, because what we realize is in the sector, and going back to the historical context of it, in the sector, organizations are working in their own little buildings, spaces, and trying to elicit change. Change doesn't happen that way. We have to start to work together, collaborate together, and think collectively about what we can do to advance the work, especially for IBPOC artists and arts organizations forward. And we also have to understand, and I try to communicate the implications of those organizations who receive public funding. It's like saying IBPOC artists and arts organizations and those from diverse communities are supporting organizations to further undermine their visibility, their representation in the society that we call civic society. So our work is multi-layered in many ways. And with Subcomo POC, we initiated a couple of things, one of which we're experiencing right now is the gathering. And what we thought to do with the gathering was to think about how we could also have a selection committee. So part of the artist showcases that you will experience and has been experiencing over the past 3 days came out of what is Subcomo POC. It came out of us understanding that there was a need to intersect organizations with presenters, with artists, all in one space, to have conversations that will hopefully broker the sense of networking, confidence for IBPOC artists and arts organizations, to meet with presenters, to have conversations, but also to amplify their voices in speaking about what exactly their needs are in the community to elicit this particular change we're talking about. And that it's about really building the communities and building the understanding through education, through programming, through workshopping, to advance the movement, to shift and change in the sector. The gathering is one such thing. For Subcomo POC organizations, we invite organizations or persons participating to actually be part of the RFS selection and programming committee, where they then choose the artists, hear about their work, and choose the artists that will be a part of the gathering every year. We have gatherings twice in the year, one in the fall and then one in the spring. That's just one where we're also forcing organizations to think about the implications of their role in the sector. It's something in my work in Canada and in Toronto a lot, and now with Subcomo, I've come to understand that we're not actually having collective conversations in space about changing the sector or influencing the sector. We're working in isolated pockets. I work primarily in dance. I realized that the white contemporary dancers were having their own conversation, Black contemporary dancers having their own conversation, and nobody was actually bringing these organizations and the conversation in one particular space. And so with Subcomo POC and with Subcomo, that's what we hope to do, is to actually animate spaces where we can have uncomfortable conversations, and we can then start to elicit the change that it's going to be, because I think that change is actually what we see demographically being shown out there. We know that cases and assessments have said there's a large engagement from IBPOC artists with the arts. We know that it also says that there are barriers to participation in the arts and that they participate differently. We're curious about, how do we speak to the National Ballet? How do we speak to the National Ballet School? How do we speak to another organization, CYDT, for example, and intersect an organization working for 35 years with training young Black dancers to now arrive in the spaces where they can be, so they can be also a visible representative on the stages that we know exist in the city. Part of our concern is then, when they walk and they're intersecting with these particular structures, how is their cultural sensitivity, as was mentioned, for those particular artists in those particular spaces? It's interesting. I have a communications degree, and for me, I'm always about the optics. I'm always about the visual representation, the representation in space and in time for the work that we do. And we lead in with challenges. So I want to end by saying, what we do is literally think of, ask organizations to develop organizational commitments and personal leadership to do the work in changing a sector and building the community, to engage in pluralist aesthetics of practices for artists and diverse communities, to involve Indigenous, racialized, marginalized artists and communities in the organizational programming and decision-making, and also the promotion of their particular work. We are curious always about not just working with the upper development areas or the senior staff of an organization, but building staffing, board membership, and audiences that is specific to the representation and reflection of Indigenous, racialized, and historically marginalized communities in their particular organization. And that takes a lot of work. And so we also work with the Subcomo program over a particular period of the year to hopefully ground all of that in education. Because I feel that for us to move and build communities, it's going to be education about how the communities are actually working and how they are evolving, but can evolve together.
Thank you, Kevin. And Mercy, through cyberspace, we did have a conversation about her presentation, and we're really glad that we were able to show that video. We have time for a couple of questions, and then I'll turn it over to Tanea to wrap up our morning session. I'm not seeing anything in the chat room right now, so I'm going to leave it. Tanea, you may have a question.
Sure, yes. Well, I have more comments, and I'll wrap up. So first, of course, it's a thank you to everybody who spoke today, and those of you participating by watching, listening, and providing resources in the chat. This has been, as we had hoped, educational, and for me, at least inspirational, and I hope for you as well. Because as I mentioned at the beginning, our goals were to provide you with information on just some of the initiatives taking place, and potentially for you to think about ways you can connect, support, and link your own work in. I have 4 takeaways today. Categorized, there's a lot of information, but categorized into 4 areas. And the first was the erasure and the importance of making the invisible visible. And that's part of what we've done here today, to continue to do that because of the historical erasure and how we need to connect to the second point, which is education. We need to learn about first the historical steps that have been taken, but also, as Kevin mentioned, what's happening now, where are people now, what is going on now, and to connect and collaborate. That helps us with self-esteem, inspiration, and building blocks. Don't create a bunch of separate things, work together and build them up. So we have erasure, education, we have incremental change through collaboration. As many speakers mentioned, things have taken time. Maybe they thought things would be faster, and then they ran across a few roadblocks and realized, no, this is going to take more time. But as Kevin mentioned, it has to. If it's being done right, it has to take time. It will take steps and moments, and it will take us coming together. And the fourth point I wanted to mention was leadership, as Ashley started us off with so beautifully. There's different forms of leadership. There are some leaders who are very visible and vocal, some who are doing work behind the scenes, and everyone in between. We all have the ability to lead in our own ways. It doesn't have to look a particular way. And we all have our unique voice, and that can be used to bring about change. As we say, but working together, let's not stay in our silos. If you've been inspired today, read the resources, research more, think about how, even if you're just sharing the information on the resources, because that's what you have the capacity to do right now. If it's that you've got your own initiative and you want to link up with a similar one you heard about today, reach out. All of the speaker information, as I mentioned, is on Subcomo website, and we hope to connect with you and continue this building. I thank you all again for such an inspirational and thought-provoking morning.